got caught looking at the wrong clock this morning, and instead of the one in here, I was looking at the one in the hallway. So it is time to begin. Certainly want to welcome everybody out this morning. Want to especially greet our visitors. Good to have you here. We are studying in the auditorium on encouragers and being people who provide encouragement as a biblical ministry that we are performing, or that we all should be performing, not only to one another but to others. And that's kind of the topic for this morning. If you would, bow with me, we'll begin the class with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this beautiful morning that you've given us, for the blessings of being able to be here, to be able to come together and have a place where we can safely and in great comfort enjoy the opportunity to study your word. And we thank you, Father, for these blessings that you've given to us. We know so many of our brothers and sisters throughout the world are not as blessed, but are equally as determined to serve you. And we pray, Father, for your blessings upon them today as well. We ask, Father, as we go through this class and all the classes here this morning, that you'll be with us to open our hearts to your word. Help us to have a clear understanding of the direction that you're setting for us. Help us to encourage one another and to have the courage to do those things we need to in order to serve you in this kingdom and in the world around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. I think. Let's see. There we go. So, been doing this every week so far, talking about, that long prayer that I put in the handout that's in the beginning of the book that we're kind of referencing, the Barnabas factor. And again, this week, the things that I want to kind of call to your attention is this middle phrase, right? Thank you for helping me overcome my fears by giving me a spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. Right? That's praying for courage. That's seeking out the Lord's help to give us the courage to do the things that we are faced with. So that's kind of our prayer focus, if you want to put it that way, for the week as we think about the things that we study today, and we kind of try to incorporate them into our toolbox. So we're going to be talking about courage today. This is week 3 in our lesson, and so we want to talk about that in a number of different ways. We'll be looking at a number of Bible verses that kind of drive us in that direction. And I want to start again by just reminding us of what is the homework from last week. What did I ask you to do as we were getting ready to break up? I kind of got a really late start on assigning homework last week, but it was basically encourage a coworker, right? And I mentioned if you're working at home, then encourage somebody else who works at home, right? Find somebody to reach out to and encourage. And I hope you took that to heart. And if not, this is another week to give yourself that opportunity to reach out and put some of the things we're talking about into practice, so that we are beginning that ministry. We're beginning to create an impression of ourselves, if it's not already the impression that others have of us, of someone who does provide encouragement and is somebody who you can kind of reliably look to for an encouraging word. Interesting thing about the study this week, which is courage is described in the chapter that we looked at in about 5 different ways. It's defined literally in about 5 different ways. Things that courage is. The first one is this idea, courage is the judgment that something else is more important than fear. We always think about courage as an opposition to fear or an overcoming of fear. And I thought it was interesting that one of the first things that we see in the chapter here is that how do you have courage? How do you do that? Well, you make a judgment that whatever it is that you need to do is more important than whatever it is you're afraid of. right? We talk about talking to people about the gospel, and what is our fear? I'm sorry? Rejection. They're gonna think we're strange. They're not gonna want to talk to us about the gospel. But what's more important than that? Their soul, right? And our responsibility to take the gospel to them. So making that judgment is what gives us the courage to overcome our fears. Another thing that he talks about in there is the inner capacity. This is, now we're getting technical. The inner capacity that enables someone to move ahead towards meaningful goals in life. It is something that is internal. I can try to build courage in you, but I can't give you courage. You have to make that inner decision, and it lets you move ahead towards something meaningful. Another one is stamina. Courage is stamina. It's the stamina to continue on a course despite fears. So it's not just the initial step out there, but it is driving forward to complete whatever the mission is that we have set in front of us. Another one is progress as opposed to paralysis. And I think this is the one that kind of hits home for me. I don't know if it hits home for you, but the contrast here is that when you're afraid of something, it's very easy to just not do anything about it, right? If a situation scares you, it's like, well, maybe it'll be better tomorrow. I won't do it today. Maybe it'll be better tomorrow. And then tomorrow it's kind of cold, so that's not really the right day. And the next day, well, I got a lot of work to do, so that's not really. So paralysis just is that whole, I'm not going to do this today. I'm not going to take this on because, it's just not right. But progress is, I don't really care what's going wrong with me today. I'm going to do this, right? So I think all of these kind of touch on different qualities when we think about courage in its operation. And I wanted to kind of just pull these out and kind of slap them up there because we're going to keep looking back at them as we talk about this. But before I do that, anybody else have a definition or a comment about these ideas of what is courage? Yeah.
As a saying on that, the difference between courage and a coward is about 2 seconds. So you have to make your mind up real quick if you're going to do something or you're not going to do something. And for most people, it don't take 2 seconds to decide I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, Lee said that, the definite difference between cowardice and courage is about 2 seconds. It's that making up your mind. And what did we talk about last week that was so important that I pulled it from week 5 to week 2? It's our mind, right? It's what is the decision that you're going to make about being an encourager? And what is the decision you're going to make about this class? Am I going to just sit here and let this stuff just kind of wash over me, or am I going to grab it and say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to get better at this, right? That's a great point, Lee. Thank you. Other thoughts? It's funny that we talked about courage so much last week when we were talking about the mind, and then here we are talking about the power that that courage delivers to us. Yes, sir.
When we read that God has not given us a spirit of fear, it seems to me like, I could be wrong, but that our default position is not to fear. Now, children fear, but for adults, it seems like fear is a learned behavior. We don't have enough faith. We're looking at the waves around us. So I believe that's what God is saying. I have not given you a spirit of fear. If you fear, you learn that on your own. When you don't trust me and walk by faith, then you'll have fear.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. David said, fear is kind of a learned behavior. It's as you get older, fear is that thing that kind of keeps you away from the spirit that God has given us. God didn't give us a spirit of fear. And I can certainly see that in my life when I was younger. oh, we'll do this, we'll do that, I'm not afraid of nothing, right? Let's go, If I lose my job, I'll find another one, Stock market goes down, that's all right, I got plenty of time, let's go, right? But I've learned fear over the years. Maybe some of that is experience of seeing what happens to other people, but I am reminded of two things about that. One is, it is learned behavior, which means I can learn other behavior, right? By putting my faith in God and by understanding what His will is and the Spirit that He's provided to me, I can learn that instead. My dad was raised on a farm in Kentucky, and out in the middle of nowhere kind of area, right? Crab orchard. But he tells a story, as people out there will, that maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but it was about a preacher that was going from town to town, preaching, holding meetings and that kind of stuff, and he was going to this town, and somebody came from that town to him and said, preacher, you don't want to go to that town. He said, why not? He says, there's some men in there that said, if you come into that town and preach, they're going to kill you. You should just turn back. So the preacher said, did Paul turn back? And I said, no. He said, then neither will I. And he kept going, right? He'd learned some behavior. He'd learned something from Paul that what happens to me here doesn't matter, right? What happens to me after is what matters. Other thoughts? All right. So let's talk about a couple of scriptural examples then. In your book, we talk about two of them, and the question is, what ignites our courage? What summons that courage to act? And so the two I want to talk about is, first is Joshua, and obviously my slide deck didn't quite go the way I'd hoped it would, but what moved Joshua, what ignited the courage in Joshua? Gee, yeah, Andy, do you know?
The awareness of God's abiding presence.
Ooh, what a really good answer. Yeah, look at Deuteronomy chapter 31, right? Deuteronomy 31, and we're going to look at verse 6 and verse 8. Verse 6 says, and this is Moses talking to Joshua. He says, be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. And then verse 8, and the Lord, He is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed. So, here's Moses. Again, Moses can't hand courage to Joshua, right? He has to ignite the courage that is inside of Joshua, and what he uses for that is the abiding presence of God. He says, remember, this is not you fighting these people when you go into the land. Remember, this is not you and your little group of Israelites. It is God. It is God who's been with us all the way. And it is God who will be with you, even when I, Moses, have gone. And so that's what lit the fire for him. What about Dan? Or yes, ma'am.
The devil has this tool in his tool belt, and that is if he senses that we feel courage and we're being courageous, I can feel it sometimes in my life where fear is creeping in. Oh, things aren't going to go well. Oh no, I'm worried. And you have, and that's the devil creeping into my heart and trying to get a hold of my faith and my courage and my faith knowing God is going to take care of the situation. And that's how I feel about it. You have to stamp that out.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Bobby said, the devil's tool is fear, right? He pulls that out and he starts to stick that in as a wedge. He tries to grow that in you and say, oh, it's not going to go well. This is not going to go like I had hoped it was going to go. It's going to be in my way, and he's going to fan that fire and fight it, and you have to stamp it out. Yes, sir?
Of course, the devil is said to be a roaring lion. And they've done research and found that the reason a lion roars is to cause a temporary freeze in the animals. When they roar, that 1 or 2 seconds, if they freeze in their tracks, the lion pounces. And instead of running, as they should, they just freeze in fear. And that's how the devil gets us today. When we're weak or sick or whatever, that's when he roars. And we've got to decide, to run or to freeze.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? David just said, the devil's a roaring lion, and a lion's roar kind of freezes somebody for, another animal for a second or two so he can pounce. Isn't it funny that we're talking about 2 seconds, and just a couple of minutes ago, Lee was talking about the difference between courage and not having courage is about 2 seconds, that moment of decision, right? That's what the devil needs. He needs just that much of a sliver between you and your faith to kind of blow it up and try to defeat you. Which I'll put in a plug while we're here, because I think this is important, right? Why is it that we come together, on the first day of the week? Why is it that we gather together and we seek the assembly of one another, and we talk about spiritual things, and we talk about Joseph, Joshua, Moses? We talk about these great heroes of faith, and what happens? It's so that those are the thoughts that come to our mind when we are challenged. Those are the thoughts that we are, that we are bringing forward when we are confronted with fear. And so the idea that we're just on this on our own, that's exactly what the devil wants you to think. Yes, sir.
Oftentimes, when we don't have courage, it's because we don't have a clear direction or mission or purpose. And we can see before us, Joshua was given a clear direction and purpose. And we as God's children, we're given a clear direction and purpose and mission in life, to love, to serve, and to share Christ. So if you keep that in mind, that can help give you that courage to stand firm.
Yeah, Joe makes a great point. When we keep our purpose in mind, that's what drives us forward. Joshua had a clear purpose that he was to operate against. We have a clear purpose, and as long as we keep that in the forefront of our mind, it will help us to have the courage to do what needs to be done. Other thoughts on Joshua? All right, tell me about Daniel. What about Daniel ignited his courage? Andy? I'm not giving it to you. You're going to have to do this one on your own.
Well, it says he resolved to not, when he first was taken into captivity, he resolved not to defile himself with the food that was offered. And that resolution, that's the courage part. I don't know what caused him to make that resolution, but that was, he just decided, whatever happens, I'm not going to do what is wrong.
Yeah, and actually it is interesting because which came first, right? The courage or the resolution. But I think you're right, which is it was his commitment, right? In Daniel 1:8, as Andrew points out, he had decided he was not going to defile himself with the king's food. He was not going to eat food that violated, his responsibilities, his dietary restrictions as a Jew. He had already made that decision, and that commitment was blessed by God. In all the circumstances where Daniel stood on his principle and said, "I'm not going to do this," God honored that. You can look at that example. You can go on into Daniel chapter 6 when it's like, "We're going to throw you in the lion's den, Daniel. You sure you don't want to? You sure you don't want to bow? You sure you don't want to renounce this praying that you do to your God? You can only pray to the king." "No, I'm good. Whatever happens, throw me on in. That's fine." Right? Because his commitment was not going to be compromised. We talk about walking by faith. That is understanding purpose, understanding the big picture, understanding You know, all the things that we tell ourselves, and maybe we just kind of get dull of hearing about it, but we talk about this world is not my home, right? This is just a temporary place that we're coming, and our real home is somewhere else. And that's the place that we want to make sure that we get to, you know. And so it's that sort of thing that kind of ignited the courage of Daniel. And you notice how it just kind of kept building on itself, right? One courageous decision leads to another, right? Because you find out pretty quickly that it's the better path, right? You know, we talk to kids all the time, right? What's the problem with lying? You got to keep track of which lies you told, right? If you just tell the truth, the story never changes. But if you lie, you got to remember, okay, I told him this, I told her that. It's really hard. It's much easier to just tell the truth, right? So all of those things, all of those principles that we teach even the youngest of our children, you know, are reinforced by what happens after, even when things don't necessarily go the way you wanted it to. I'm sure Daniel didn't particularly relish the idea of getting thrown into a lion's den, but he's like, well, yeah, what happens, happens. I'm still going to live my life, you know, in accordance to these values. So, point here is that something ignites our courage. You know, some people are naturally bent that way, right? They are strong and courageous from the get-go. Some people have to have it grown and developed and encouraged, but we all are called upon to make those kind of commitments and decisions. We are all called upon to have courage. And this is the other piece, right, is that courage feeds discipline. You know, the examples that we talk about in here is that when you make that commitment to your values, it helps you develop a discipline. You know, it is not easy for someone who has spent 20, 30, 40 years. Sunday morning is my day to sleep till noon. Sunday is my day to just kind of prop around in my pajamas all day and read the paper and watch the game and whatever. I don't do anything on Sundays. Well, actually, we kind of come together and assemble on Sundays. We worship the Lord. Sunday is the Lord's day. You know, that is a commitment that you make when you decide to become a Christian. And over time, making that commitment and honoring that commitment feeds the discipline that you need to make it consistently. Yes?
This is something I've thought about. Is there a physical manifestation in your body, even though your mind's saying you have the courage in your mind? I mean, I just can't imagine Daniel being thrown into a den of lions and not having the heart about to beat out of his chest. Or is there no physical manifestation of fear in the body itself, even though you have the courage to want to do God's will? I mean, humanly. I just have struggled with that because I think, man, when I get afraid of something, I'm really afraid, and I feel it. You know, you feel it. So.
Yeah, and Marcia asked, is there a physical manifestation, you know, is it of your fear, even though you've made the decision to be courageous in the face of it? Does it manifest courage, or does it manifest fear? Is that your question? I mean,
Mindset, I want to do God's will no matter what, but if you're confronted with people coming to put you in prison or to curse or to torture you or whatever because of your stand for the Lord, do you not have any fear of that?
well, I mean, I can speak personally when I've had to do hard things because I have messed up, and I have had to have the courage to repent and to go talk to people and say, hey, you know, I was afraid, right? But again, it's, you know, courage is not the absence of fear. You know, we go back to those things we talked about there, right? Courage is the decision that something is more important than this fear. No matter how terrified I am, I may be so terrified that I can barely move, but something is more important than that, and I am going to fight past it. And I still think we all manifest fear, to something, but I think the idea of courage is no matter what that is, once you've made your mind up, we're doing this, you just battle through it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, Daniel was a young man being thrown into he was young, but he was met with challenges and God was with him and showed him. So he was being built up to almost like this big crescendo of the lion's den, like when he refused to eat the king's food. Well, there could have been repercussions for that too. But that went well for him. So things like this, when we look back on our lives, we can see how God worked in our lives. And then we can build our courage on those things. He was there. He did that for me. I feel that. So next time you have to make a choice though, to remember those things and feed on that, not on the fear.
Yeah, Bobby said, the experience that Daniel had over life built up his courage, built up his knowing that God was with him so he could rely on that. I'm sure he was still fearful, but he was not going to let that beat him, because he had set his mind that way. Yes, sir.
I mean, talking about the physical manifestations, call it fear or dread or whatever you want, but I mean, even Jesus before the cross, as Luke told us, basically sweated blood. So, but that wasn't going to stop him from accomplishing what he knew he had to accomplish.
Yeah, I think talking about Jesus, the night before he's crucified, when he's about to be arrested, praying so hard that he's literally sweating blood, and basically, essentially telling God, I do not want to do this. If we can do this some other way, that'd be really good. But, if this is your will, I'm going to do it, And I can't imagine being, I've been pretty scared before, but I have never been scared to that degree. And yet here's Jesus basically saying, any other way, and yet still I'm going to do this. So that's the courage, and I think that's a great example. Somebody here, I'm sorry. Somebody else have a thought? Yes, sir.
I'd say that there's a mindset in everybody's mind that's a fight or flight. And experiences teach you and help you be able to deal with those situations. But everybody's got that fight or flight. Some people are born with it. Some people through experiences and occupations develop those situations that they can deal with it. I think that's the same thing with us as Christians. When we first come Christians, we're excited, but we really want to fight about it. Especially when you get family, workers, and relatives, and stuff like that. But again, all our minds are filled with fight or flight. No matter what the situation is, same thing with Christianity. We either stand for God or we don't stand for God. Sometimes it takes maturity and spiritual maturity to be able to fight that spirit to fight.
Yeah, Charlie's talking about the fight or flight impulse that we all, that people have, and he's making that comparison here, right? It's the same kind of thing, and even, like he said, when you first become a Christian, it's exciting, it's new, but it's also intimidating, right? Because, you're going to talk to people who that's not the side of you they know, right? And you're, how bold are you going to be with that? And I think this is a really good time to make the point to not get swallowed up in failure. If you fail in your courage on something, give yourself a break, right? But resolve that next time we're not going to fail, right? And so, courage is something that is tested all the time with all the things that we go through as Christians. Maybe we don't get 100 on the test all the time, but we know we should, and we know we strive for that, and we know that we are working to build up that courage. And again, I'll say this is a forum for that. This is where we talk about the things that build up our courage. Yes, sir.
Something I've had to learn is, I'm not going to go the way of fear, and I'm going to trust God for the outcome, but I find myself trying to manipulate the situation or manipulate a person. And, Daniel could have closed his window. He said, well, I don't have to have that window open. There's nothing that says I have to do it. I'll just close the window. Well, he would be manipulating the situation, but he didn't. He put his trust totally in God and said, I don't have to know what the outcome is going to be. Because we manipulate. We say, well, I'm not compromising the fear. I'm going to proceed. But then we try to manipulate situations to our favor. And that's not walking totally by faith. Daniel just said, if I die, I die. That's God's will. This world's not my home anyway.
Yeah, Dave said, we make that choice, but then, sometimes maybe we try to tweak the circumstances in our favor. Maybe that, there are circumstances where I could see that be okay. There are circumstances where maybe that's not walking by faith like I want to walk by faith. And I'm reminded, since we're talking about Daniel and the book, right, his three buddies, right, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what did they tell the king? They said, you know what? Our God is able to deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we're not going to do this, right? So they had faith. They also had the practical reality that this might not be their day, right? That God might not protect them, but that was up to God. In either case, they had made their own commitment and their own stand. And so that was what they were trying to drive for. Yes, sir?
To me, courage is the willingness to face the unknown.
I like that. Courage is the willingness to face the unknown. And really, so much of our fear is the fear of the unknown, right? What if, when I talk to this person, they reject me? What if this person takes, what if, and I'm going to pick on Al because we're buds, right? What if when I go to Al and try to encourage him, he looks at me like I'm being prideful and haughty, and he kind of backs away from, who do you think you are trying to buck me up, right? But, that's a fear, right? I don't know. And so I shy away from it. And I think that's a great point, is you got to overcome the fear of the unknown. Yes?
The word for that is trichodecaphobia, and that's fear of the unknown. The more Joshua heard from Moses the words of God, the more courage Joshua had. The more Jesus taught his disciples, the more courage they had because of the unknown there, as we talked about there. The unknown's going to get you.
Yeah, Lisa, the unknown will get you, but the more Joshua heard that God was with him, the more courage he had, the less fear he had. The more Jesus' disciples heard, the less fear they had, the more willingness they had. So I think all of that is again, instructive for us. Andy, did you have a thought?
It's kind of building on what Bobby was talking about earlier. When Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, I put them in the wrong order.
That's okay.
Anyway, when they were young, they encouraged each other because they were all in the same circumstance. They all had the same challenge. And they all decided together, I think, to do what was right. And like Bobby was saying, God blessed their decision, and they came out of it well. And then we see Daniel and then the three separately challenged in different ways. And I think that building up of their courage early on, like you're saying, helped in later situations. They learned from that experience, but it started with them helping each other when they were together in the same spot.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we talk about how courage builds on courage, and being able to look back at, when you made a stand and how that worked out. There's the secular phrase, right? The brave man dies one death, but the coward dies 1,000 deaths, right? Because he's so worried about what might happen, you know, but most of the time, you know, what we imagine as the worst circumstance doesn't actually happen, right? So I asked you to come up with 3 examples of courage that we need today in order to live pleasing to God. I think in your notes it said love pleasing to God, and you know, that works too, but my typo passed the spell check. But you know, so before I throw the 3 that I put up there, I'm just going to ask for a couple of examples. You know, where do we need courage today to live pleasing to God? Yes, ma'am.
I'll admit, I'm a little afraid of this. And that is confronting homosexuality head-on in public, in situations where I know I should be taking a stand. And I feel myself shrinking away from fear. And I need to work on it.
Okay. So Bobby says when she feels like she needs to be taking a stand and, you know, against sin in general, and specifically in this case, she talks about needing to confront homosexuality. And it's, you know, I want to make sure I come back to that specifically, but I think the idea, if I could take that and make it broader, the idea of reacting against sin in general.
It's hard.
No, I completely understand where you're coming from, and you know, and to be clear, right, it is the behavior that is sinful, right? Just like adultery, you know, or any you know, any other sexual immorality, it is the behavior that is sinful. You know, anything that is outside of the parameters that God has set forth for that relationship between 2 people, you know, that's, you know, it could be people who are living together that aren't married, it could be people who are in an adulterous relationship, could be homosexuality, all of those, you know, we have, you know, a number of us have friends who are in those kind of relationships, or family that are in those kind of relationships. Now, there is a mental element to it as well, but I understand where you're coming from. Sir?
I think one of the ways that God calls us to action that takes courage is being vulnerable with our brothers and sisters, being open about things that we might not be comfortable sharing. That's one of the things that we're called to do, but we a lot of times like to compartmentalize and say, okay, well, that's my Sunday crew, that's my Tuesday crew, and I don't really let those overlap. And that's one of the things that God calls us to do that can be wildly uncomfortable sometimes, is being vulnerable and open with our brothers and sisters about the struggles that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And you know, Caleb said, you know, being vulnerable with one another about what our issues are, right? What we struggle with. You know, problems with, I don't know how to do this, right? And you know, in addition to that, you know, he makes a great point, right? We have our Sunday crowd and we have our Tuesday crowd. We don't necessarily let those cross over to one another. But God calls us to lean on one another for support. And you know, we talk about issues that we struggle with. That's why we come together, right? You're not given, I mean, we are given the instruction manual, right? But understanding how you apply the instruction manual to every circumstance and every situation is why you have elders and older people and longtime Christians and great students of the Bible where you could say, I'm really struggling here. I don't know how to confront this issue. Help me. I don't want to do it wrong. I feel like I need to do something. What is that? And then seeking the help from others. Sir.
I think, to me, one of the things that were encouraging, at least for me, is really with regard to like how you just let God be first priority in your life. you know, and I know that may sound simple in a way, but when the rubber meets the road and we actually got to put it into action, how many times do we, you know, cower down and say, well, we can go to the ball tournament today. It's the Lord's Day, but we'll go. We'll miss, you know, or we can go to, you know, miss Wednesday night services or something, whatever it might be. You know, we just don't put God, you know, and not only that, but like in our decision making and how we live our lives, like, you know, from anything to how we run our families to like guides our political views even, you know, things like that. I mean, God needs to come first and always needs to, and the world don't always view it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, and I think it's not simplistic. It is kind of simple, but that's what it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be simple, not simplistic, right? It's supposed to be the kind of challenges that we face. And when we face hard topics where we know that, you know what, if I'm going to bring this up, it's going to, already know this is not going to be a fun conversation, right? How do I approach that? How do I say, listen, I'm coming to you out of love. I'm coming to you out of concern. I just want to talk about this. Right? It's a challenge, right? Sir?
Yeah, I'd say the courage to be at least as internally focused as you are external. And by that I mean, it's very easy, you know, as we see what I think in Matthew about it's very easy to look for problems other people have, and in some degree, you know, even, I mean, we know it's hard to go to a brother and tell them, you know, hey, you've got this thing going on, but how much harder is it to look at your own self before you even do that, and look for, you know, issues you have and look to solve those yourself. So I think, you know, especially as the question is worded, you know, where do we need courage to live a life pleasing to God, is to really be inwardly focused in examining ourselves. I think sometimes we lack that quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One of the areas that we need courage is to look inside at ourselves and be challenged by the truth and be challenged by our own shortcomings and decide to make a change there, you know, before we necessarily, you know, so, and it's both, right? Because we still have that responsibility to look out for one another, but, you know, we need courage to look inside as well. Other thoughts? So I'm going to throw my three up on the board, just, you know. So I put this. The first one is beginning the journey, right? We've talked about this a couple of times, right? It takes courage. You know, even this morning, you know, if someone's thinking about becoming a Christian, it takes courage to get out into the aisleway and come on down here, or to catch somebody afterwards and say, you know, I just can't wait. I need to become a Christian. It takes a lot of courage to do that. That is a hard thing for that person because, you know, they're accepting a whole new thing, right? And it takes a lot of courage. You know, talking about speaking your faith out loud in front of others, and Bobby, I think part of this is, you know, kind of the stuff you're talking about. How do I confront hard issues out in public with people? How do I speak my faith out loud in love? You know, how do I do that? And when I know that I'm talking about something and something is wrong, and I'm saying, listen, I can't agree with that, right? My Lord tells me this, and I can't go along with that, right? And then, you know, I think maybe hitting a little bit on what JD was talking about, placing your faith in God in the face of internal struggles, right? Both on the negative and the positive side, not only examining yourself for issues, but then also overcoming those voices that say, don't do this. You know, you can't, this never goes well for you. Don't step out there. You know this isn't going to go right? But, you know, that's an internal struggle that you have, you know, not just I'm not doing well enough, but also, this never works when I go talking to people about Jesus. Oh, no, I don't want to do that, right? I mean, those are big deal issues, right? And we have to, you know, we talk to one another about them, or we should, right? That's part of why we're all here, is so we can grow and build and develop the courage to fight the battles that we are facing. Not everybody has the same battles, but I bet you most people have had most of them in one form or another. And so we have to be willing to, call on our courage. It takes courage to go to a brother who you think has done you wrong, right? The easy answer is, I won't even approach him, right? I'll just avoid him for the next 40 years. It'll be fine, right? It's harder to go and say, you know what? We got to talk. You did something that really hurt me, and I don't think it was right. And that's hard. Take some courage. And on the other end of that, if you're the recipient of a conversation like that, remember to give a little grace to that person. It took a lot of courage for them to come talk to you, right? Instead of immediately going, how dare you question me, right? Maybe say, wow, that the courage it took to come have that conversation should compel me to at least listen to you, because you wouldn't have done it if it wasn't really a challenge. So all of those things fit together. So I think we've got lots of verses here, and I'm going to, we got like 3 minutes, so I'm going to put them all up here, right? But I think a lot of these we've kind of talked about, right? God gave us a spirit of power and love and not fear. And you look at these verses, and they are all talking about our mind. They're all talking about our attitude. They're all talking about how we process the challenges that we are faced with. And so we look at those and we say, okay, these verses are all telling me or giving me instruction on how to react to the things that we have, right? And I think, the three areas that they talk about in the book, and I kind of like the way this works, right, is if you're talking about courage, courage comes down to three things. One of them is attitudes, right? Attitudes affect performance. We talked about this a lot last week, right? Your mind and your body are connected, right? Beliefs, right? What was it that caused Joshua and Daniel to have courage? It was their faith, right? And then expectations, right? It's fighting the voice in your head, right, that says this is not going to go well, right? When Jesus and the disciples were in the storm and they woke him up and said, we're going to perish, he says, why are you afraid? You have so little faith, right? Jesus made the connection. Your fear is because of your lack of faith, right? Put those two together. So those are there. And I know I heard the first bell, but I do want to make two more points. One of them is that courage alone is not enough, right? You can have the courage of your convictions, and your convictions can be wrong. And so you have to have more than just courage and conviction. You have to find the truth and let that then build your courage off of there. And so, because courage is what will let us choose the thing that is right over the thing that is easy, right? And my lesson from this is I need the courage to challenge my own convictions. I may be totally convicted about something and someone wants to come talk to me about it. Let's sit down and study it, right? All right, that's always after the bell, but what's your homework for next week? Encourage a friend. Find some creative way and encourage a friend. Thank you for your time.